we didn't call it supply chain back then. It was largely called logistics.
How do you balance the speed, the cost, the resilience? There's so many, different metrics. How do you balance all of that within the global market?
Yes. So all of that is, you have to take it all in, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes you need speed, right?
And CPG is one of the most challenging industry. A lot of people don't understand. I would love to hear some of the weirdest things you've gone through. Even one, the most unexpected thing that you've seen in CPG.
So I think most people can defer back to the COVID years, and I was in a CPG, worked for a CPG company at the time, and the company made goods for working out in your yard.
How do you help companies to not fall into that trap, right? That this is the process, we're going to stick to this process. No, now we're going to move into this process. How does that work? How do you cope with that?
Continuous improvement is very near and dear to my heart. And, I tell people that continuous improvement is part of my DNA.
What is that one thing that you've learned, early on in your career that you still use it? You still lead that by today?
I had a wonderful manager when I took on my first supply chain role. Business is mostly about relationships. That's when you're going to start being the most effective.
Welcome everyone to the Vserve e-business solution podcast on supply chain management, where we invite some of the great industry experts to talk about their experience and hopefully gather some helpful tips along the way. I'm Cynthia, your host, and today we're joined by a dynamic, versatile supply chain and operations leader. He has over 30 years of experience, very passionate about problem solving, and he has a proven track record of helping businesses overcome hurdles and drive their profitable growth. He's an expert in everything from global logistics and S&OP to lean manufacturing and data analytics. So please help me in joining. Welcome, Robert Labadorf. Am I saying that correctly?
That's pretty good. Yes, Labadorf is a little closer, but you got it pretty good.
Perfect. Well, Robert, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for your time, and we are very interested to learn about your career and your background. So we'll start from there. Tell us a little bit about why supply chain and how you got into this industry.
Sure. Well, first of all, Cynthia, thank you for inviting me to the podcast. I do like to share with others and hope that this finds its way to others and they can find it useful. So I am a supply chain guy, as I like to call it, with kind of an operations focus within supply chain. I am an industrial engineer by degree, and industrial engineers were taught back when I went to school a lot about supply chain and amongst other things. And, we didn't call it supply chain back then. It was largely called logistics. Supply chain term kind of came around a little bit after I got out of school. But so that's where I kind of got my feet wet with supply chain and operations. But I went into manufacturing and spent the first half of my career in manufacturing. About 8 years in, I took my first supply chain role in a manufacturing plant. That's kind of when I fell in love with supply chain. And, I've held many different positions since then. Corporate positions, I've held roles in aftermarket spare part and business planning, as well as global logistics. So I've really had an opportunity to do a lot of great things and really enjoy what I do.
And which one has been your favorite sector of all of these different things you've done over the years?
There really hasn't been one. I love watching things come from, made from raw materials to, finished goods. I've enjoyed the CPG market, consumer packaged goods markets, because that tends to be more tangible to what people think of when they think of things being made, right? But I've also been wire and cable. I've been in construction equipment. So I've been in, other industries that a lot of people don't think about because, we're making things that make things or making things that provide something versus something that goes on a shelf in a store. So yeah, probably more on the CPG side because it's a little bit more relevant to a lot of the folks.
Yeah. And CPG is one of the most challenging, industry. A lot of people don't understand. I would love to hear some of the weirdest things you've gone through. Even one, the most unexpected thing that you've seen in CPG.
So I think most people can defer back to the COVID years, and I was in a CPG, worked for a CPG company at the time, and the company made goods for working out in your yard, so grass seed and fertilizers, and and pest controls and whatnot. And a lot of the product itself was made here in the United States, right? So grass seed was grown here. A lot of the chemicals were formulated and made here in the United States. But what was the problem during COVID, as everybody was spending all their money at home, was the container, whether they were bags, whether they were bottles, whether they were caps, spray heads, that became the problem. So we would have the actual product that somebody wanted. We just couldn't get it on the shelf into a form that they could use it. And, that was pretty unique at the time. And I think that happened to a lot of CPG companies that, did their manufacturing here in the States. Packaging became, some of the biggest limiters to them being able to get the products onto store shelves.
Yeah, we definitely heard a lot about that during our COVID years as well. And, from your experience being in, so many different areas of supply chain, in terms of end-to-end supply chain integration, like what is the true version of it? What would you say actually fits the goal?
Well, so, a lot of people, when they think of end-to-end supply chain integration, they think of systems, right? And systems are extremely important.
Yeah.
You want to have systems that connect up and down your supply chain, but a lot of it is also the connection of peoples and processes. So, connecting information that's coming from your suppliers and being able to pass it on to your customer. Without openness and willingness to communicate and transparency, you don't really have a true end supply chain. If you have people that work in silos, right? And sometimes people are incentivized to work in silos, unfortunately. And so they don't share information as freely as they should. And so what you find in some supply chains is people know a lot of what's going on, right? But it's just not being passed through. And while technology is a huge player in integrating a supply chain, open communication and honesty and transparency and willingness to share when sometimes things aren't working as well as you want them to, so that your downstream customers can pivot or make adjustments where necessary.
That's interesting. So in terms of then global logistics, when you're looking at sourcing, fulfillment, and all of that, how do you approach that? How do you balance the speed, the cost, the resilience? There's so many different metrics. How do you balance all of that within the global market?
So all of that is, you have to take it all in, right? Sometimes you need speed, right? Sometimes you have products that are going to have a short span of time that they sell, right? Or you're second to the market, right? Or you're a follower in the market. In that case, you need that speed, right? In other cases, where you're going to have a longer tail, right? Something that's going to last for much longer, or you're the first one to bring it to market, you can focus a little bit more on the cost, right? Because speed is less of a concern. Ultimately, though, you need to be resilient, and that means you can't put all your eggs in one basket. You need to look at dual sourcing. You need to contingency plan, right? I did a little bit of that when our new executive administration was elected in November. We did a lot of scenarios on, well, what would happen if tariffs went up to X here or here or here, and what do we need to do today to be ready in those different scenarios? So you really have to rely on all of it, speed, cost, and resilience in order to have a strong global supply chain.
So in terms of when you're looking at all of these different metrics, what are the top 3 things that you always look for? These are the top 3 things we should look for before we start doing anything, metrics wise.
So from a metric standpoint, I always will defer to a couple of things. One is customer satisfaction, right? And whether you're in CPG or you're providing something B2B to another company, any type of customer satisfaction metric, and you can talk your typical OTIF, on time and full. You can do surveys with your customers to get satisfaction ratings back from them. But I think that's where it starts, because ultimately most companies these days are in the business to serve some sort of customer, and that's where the tires hit the road is fulfill and meet those customer expectations. But without being profitable, you don't have a business. So then you have to look at your costs, right? And whether it's your costs of your raw materials, costs of products that you're importing, your labor costs, overhead costs, you always have to be looking at your costs, because if you're ultimately at the end of the day not profitable, you don't have a viable business.
Exactly.
Within supply chain, there's a lot of different metrics. I'm a big inventory guy, so I spend a lot of time ensuring that we're properly evaluating our inventory on a regular basis. Inventory is listed as an asset on your financials, but it can end up being a liability if you have too much of it. So it's appropriate balance. So again, start with the customer. Right, those are some of the key metrics, OTEF, and then move on to your costs, and ultimately whether you're making money, and then any other metrics that help drive your business. Ultimately, continue to remain profitable and continue to better yourself.
Exactly. And inventory management, so many podcasts that we've done over a few weeks here, and everybody has kind of highlighted inventory as being one of the most important metrics. So according to you, like when it comes to growth, like scaling rapidly or entering new market, how are companies supposed to be aligning? Like what are some things they should look for in terms of inventory management?
Well, again, inventory is an asset, right? You spend money to either buy it or make it. So it's an asset. You don't want it to turn into a liability, though. And you also need to be careful, because you can tie up too much cash in inventory, and then you don't have that cash to use either capital investments or buying new machinery or hiring new people. So you got to be careful. With inventory, you need real-time visibility, right? And one of the things with CPG that I learned is understanding what's happening at the cash registers at your retailers is very important, because they have inventory in their distribution centers, they have inventory in their stores, and unless you know how the inventory is moving, you don't exactly know when you're going to get that signal, that purchase order, or that pull signal to order more. So visibility is key. And whether that's at your retailers, whether that's on your own shelves, whether that's at your suppliers, right? Having visibility of what their inventories are. And then, ultimately with inventory, not all inventory is created equal. Sometimes you need more inventory. You're going to turn that inventory slower because it's more critical to your customer. Say you are, one supplier for it, right? Or in the case of your selling spare parts for the machineries that you sold, and these are critical spare parts, you may need to have a few more, right? Versus more commoditized product. Maybe there's more options. You never want to lose a sale, but if your customer has the option of buying it somewhere else, if you run out, it's less critical to your customer that you have it on the shelf. So, you have to segment your customers, you have to segment your inventory, and you have to treat it differently. You can't treat your inventory as the same. There's reasons why you carry more and less for different SKUs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And now that we have entered almost like a highly digitized age in supply chain, especially with AI and modern technology, with data analytics, where do you see like these tools helping out, but also kind of damaging the traditional way of doing things?
So, there's a lot of talk these days about digitization in supply chain and data analytics. Data is very important, albeit you've got to be careful, because you can get bogged down in data. And that's why, having those systems that help you see through a lot of the noise is extremely important. So there's been some shifts lately, right? We're used to dashboards, right? More descriptive type of analytics, where what happened in the past, right? Where a lot of digitalization's going in supply chain, and there's some really cool things like digital twins. It's allowing companies to model their supply chain and be able to do scenario analysis to find out, well, what happens if a port gets shut down, or what happens, a big demand spike, right? And you can simulate what is going to happen with your supply chain utilizing some of the technology that's out there today. So there's really some cool stuff going on. AI, I use AI just about every day. If you're not using it, you're really going to fall behind. That not just in supply chain, but really in any business these days. And where AI is going to take us, who knows? I'd love to be able to use AI more in forecasting. That's one of my goals here as going forward, is trying to figure out how to use some of these very strong algorithms to help us figure out, and predict, sales trends and what. So a lot going on in the digital world relative to supply chain, and a lot of exciting things are surely to happen.
Perfect. So I do use AI myself, so I cannot see how I cannot be using AI on my daily days. But there are places where we shouldn't be using it as well. Is there anything that kind of stands out at you from today's perspective that people are using things that they shouldn't be using? It's like, okay, we should be doing this the old way, not this way.
Well, there's, first of all, with AI, you have to be very careful. These AI models are not perfect. So you can't just assume that what they're going to spit back out to you is perfect. So you still have to rationalize and utilize human intuition to look at anything that a computer spits out, and make sure it's rational. Ultimately, though, supply chain, you can throw a lot of technology at improving your supply chain. I'm a big proponent, though, being, very open and communicative to my customers, to my suppliers. I want to give my suppliers purchase forecasts, not because I want them to hold me accountable to buying those, but if that helps them work with their suppliers in making sure they have the materials necessary and lower my lead times, I want to do that. I also want to be very transparent with my customers and let them know there are times when no is the answer. And, that's unfortunate. You never want to say no to a customer, but sometimes either costs are such that you have to say no. But being able to have those hard conversations with the customers usually is preceded by having very good relationships with them, and them recognizing that you're not saying no because you want to say no. You're saying no because it's what they're asking for is just not feasible. So if you have those strong relationships within your supply chain, in my opinion, it's as much important to have those types of relationships and open communication as it is to have this great technology.
Yeah, definitely. We've been reading a lot about you and the work you've done, and you've been advising businesses through a lot of these different eras of, things that have been coming along. So what does your kind of game plan look like? I would say the first 90 days. What does that typically look like when you're stepping into these kind of roles?
So a lot of it has to do with, at least the first 30 days is listening, right? And diagnosing, right? The last thing anybody wants to hear from you as you walk through the door is, I see this, and this that we can fix. You may see a lot of that stuff right off the bat, right? But that's not how you should walk through the door. When you walk through the door, it's about listening. It's about diagnosing, asking questions. In the next month, right? You can start to align on priorities that you're with your client, right? What is it exactly that you're looking from me, right? So that I can kind of position myself to, work with them in the way that they want to work, right? And then, maybe 60, 90 days, you start the execution. But, a lot of communication, a lot of learning, a lot of relationship building, right? Again, I use that R word a lot, but it's extremely important. You can't just can't walk into an organization, even when you see a lot of the opportunities, and just start pointing them out. There's a kind of this process that you have to take when you engage with a new client.
Great. And what's your take when you're going into a company and you see there are, possibilities of offshoring something or outsourcing something within today's supply chain? I think it has become a reality for cost saving and efficiencies. How do you kind of, see those areas, and how do you address those in those, 90-day plans?
So, offshoring, nearshoring, reshoring, big words these days. And, with the tariffs that are being placed here in the United States, particularly, anybody who is manufacturing in the United States and doing it successfully, I give them the utmost credit. It's very difficult today, particularly in certain types of goods, to be competitive. So much has been offshored to lower cost countries that it's difficult. But in the same breath, there's a lot of people who have offshored their manufacturing and are now looking or being forced to look at reshoring or nearshoring because of the tariffs. And it
Yeah.
is possible. It is possible to still be cost competitive and do it here. And there's a lot to be gained, right?
Yeah.
I've done a lot of business sourcing from China. China literally is on the other side of the world. And when you think about what it takes to get goods made and shipped all the way around the world,
Yeah.
there's a time there, right? It's usually 3 weeks of goods sitting on the water, and that's inventory, right?
Yeah.
So if you can get it made in a country close to your current country, say Mexico, Canada, Latin America, you're going to
Hmm.
cut that transit time down significantly. But you can't, again, I don't think there's an all-in-one strategy. There are companies that are made in the USA only, and sometimes they're very cost competitive. Sometimes they have to charge a premium. But people in the United States, and I'm assuming elsewhere in the world, like
Hmm.
to buy product that is made in their country and are willing to
Exactly.
pay for that additional premium. So it really depends on what the company that I'm working with is trying to achieve, right? Do they want to be a made in the USA or made in XYZ, or are they looking to be more cost competitive? And it also could be where they are in their maturity with their product, because sometimes you can start off here making.
Perfect. And I completely agree with you in terms of tariffs that are going on right now. It's been a struggle and companies doing that. But do you think there's still back office functions like, order management or forecasting, supplier communications, things like that, that can still be outsourced in your view, that can help companies still save money if they're not doing those kind of services?
Absolutely. What I would suggest though is what could be outsourced needs to be more transactional, right? Order management is a pretty good example, right? Following up on purchase orders, getting updates of when things have shipped or where they are in the process of being fulfilled, very transactional in nature, right?
Yeah.
Things like forecasting, though, yes, there are some transactional pieces of that, some data analysis that can probably be outsourced, but ultimately the forecasts need to be owned by within the four walls of the company, right? Because the forecasting and the planning of the business is very particular and is very people centric. So, but there are definitely things that can be outsourced, and there's good reasons to do that. There a lot of customer services is outsourced, largely because there are companies out there that do it very well. And why
Hmm.
wouldn't you do it, right? Now you have to be careful with anything where you're talking directly to the customer and have really strict alignment with your outsourced partner and what you want them to communicate, because that's extremely important. They're speaking to either consumer or customer. But there's definitely things that because of them being a little bit more transactional in nature, make them very suitable for outsourcing.
What kind of roles should be kept in-house and what kind of roles should be kept, outsourced as well. So I would love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, again, transactional processes are very suitable to be outsourced. Things that, and some analytics can be outsourced, but, decision making or things that are very important to the nature of the business really need to stay within the four walls. So, managing orders, if you have,
Hmm.
hundreds of purchase orders and you need a team to help make sure that your suppliers are fulfilling on time, sure, absolutely. Even in some cases, working directly with customers, either through
Hmm.
call centers or whatnot. Again, as long as you have alignment when you're talking about customer facing or customer interaction of, what the expectations are, because, they are speaking on your behalf, and it's extremely
Hmm.
important that the messages that they're providing match with what you want the customers to hear. So definitely opportunities to outsource. There are lower cost options out there for many things, and you'd be remiss not to consider those types of things to try to take advantage of some of the cost savings.
Definitely. And it's been like with teams, right? Building the culture of these
Mhm.
continuous improvement, whether you're doing nearshoring or offshoring. How do you help companies to not fall into that trap, right? That this is the process. We're going to stick to this process. process. No, now we're going to move into this process. Like, how does that work? How do you cope with that?
Continuous improvement is very near and dear to my heart. And,
Mhm.
I tell people that continuous improvement is part of my DNA. It kind of goes back. I was first of four children. My father was in the Air Force, so I was kind of the
Mhm.
experiment child. And then I
Uh-huh.
went to engineering school and got an engineering degree,
Mhm.
particularly centered around industrial engineering, which is people and process, right? That coupled with the first position I held out of college, I worked on a lean manufacturing implementation team. So all of that very early on in my life kind of set the foundation for continuous improvement. And
Mhm.
I look at continuous improvement just not in my professional life, but in my personal life too. And most people do, but I kind of have this quirky way of trying to figure out how to do little tasks around the house, particularly those that are not fun to do, try to figure out
Uh-huh.
how to do them a little quicker or more efficient. Continuous improvement, though, needs to have a purpose, right? It's not just about doing something, a little faster. If it's not having a positive impact from a business standpoint on your customer, on your
Mhm.
business, on your employees, you're really just kind of kidding yourself and
Yeah.
trying to do continuous improvement activity. It really has to have a purpose. And, the other thing I'll say about continuous improvement, it doesn't have to be huge improvements either, right?
Mhm.
A lot of the times, making incremental improvements is just as important in making big leaps and bounds of change. And, I always like to talk to people about moving the needle, right? Every day, let's just try to move the needle a little bit more, but move
Mhm.
it for the right reason, right? We're not just doing continuous improvement to say we do it. There really
Mhm.
has.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And you have won, from what I understand, both strategic and hands-on operational hats.
Mhm.
So, which part energizes you the most? Like, I think I know the answer, but which part makes you feel a bit more like enhanced?
So, it's really hard to say whether being in more of a strategic role or a tactical role is more exciting for me. I
Mhm.
really like when you get to do both and you get to see the strategy that
Mhm.
you envisioned get put into place, right?
Practically.
And
Yeah.
so it's the kind of the combination of where strategy and implementation
Mhm.
really come together is what
Yeah.
excites me. And I'd like strategy maybe a little bit more because it also, involves working a lot with others and
Mhm.
encouraging others to participate in the discussions and into the projects. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with floor employees in a manufacturing facility or in a warehouse facility that have
Mhm.
some amazing ideas, right? And
Yeah.
they have had these great ideas for a while, but nobody's ever asked them to share. And
Yeah.
so involving people in those discussions about, if we want to do something better, how would you do it better? So again, to answer your question, it's really both. It's both the strategy and the hands-on piece. Both excite me, largely when they kind of come together and you get to see the fruits of your and your team's efforts in,
Yeah.
again, moving that needle a little bit each day.
That's amazing. I would have said more like strategic side, but I completely understand when you say both. And what is that one thing that you've learned, like, early on in your career that you still like, use it? Like you still lead that by today?
I had a wonderful manager. And this was when I took on my first supply chain role,
Hmm.
and I was very transactional in nature, coming from my upbringing, as I mentioned, being the first of four children with my father, who was an Air Force captain, going into
Yeah.
engineering school. It was very numbers based, very very black and white,
Hmm.
and I had a wonderful manager who told me fairly early on. It said, Rob, when you realize that business is mostly about relationships, that's when you're going to start being the most effective. And
Hmm.
it took me probably a year or two after he shared that with me before it really started to click. And I have to this day taken that and I've shared that same philosophy with some of the younger folks who work with me or work around me, particularly if they're very black and white and transactional like I was. So it's that relationship building, being willing to be open and honest, being willing to work together for a common purpose. That's the biggest thing that I would share back early on with my earlier self, because I wish I had gotten a little better grasp of that earlier in my career.
And how has that helped you to kind of, mentor or upskill like people that you're training now when they're getting on these burned out like supply chain teams that you're going into? How does that work?
Well, a lot of folks, I'll say this. I've met maybe one or two people in my career, but everybody wants to do a good job. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's rare that you're going to find somebody that is just, all they want is to get a paycheck and, they're not concerned about the quality of the work. That's so rare. And so, whenever I've come into a team and I see individuals that may be beat down or, underappreciated, a lot of it is giving them some time, right?
Yeah.
Giving them an ear, right? As a leader or somebody that will step into a company to try to help them. A lot of it's, asking a question and then just waiting for the silence to end and letting them tell you what they think. And depending on what kind of leadership or culture they've been a part of up to then, they may be very reluctant to share. So you got to, again, offer them the trust that, particularly if it's one-on-one, you can share in confidence with me anything that you don't want to leave the room. And once you start develop, again, the R word, relationships with some of these folks, you will start to pull them out of that, maybe there is more to what I can offer this company than just what I do here every day. And that, people are listening. So, it's really important. And we talked about this earlier. You can't just kind of come into an organization and start pointing fingers, right? Nobody wants that, right? It's about listening. It's about observing. It's about having conversations and getting people's input. It's amazing what you can do in turning somebody who has very confined outreach and bringing them out. Extrovert, introvert, it doesn't matter. If you don't feel as though that your opinion is worth anything, you're probably not going to share it. So, if you can pull that out of folks, it's amazing the information you get. And some of the best things that we've ever implemented as far as work that I have been a part of has been from people who are actually doing the work, not from me, not from other managers. It's learning from them, but getting it out of them. So I think it's important to listen, to have empathy, right? Because everybody's typically going through something, and most of the time you don't know it. So being open, listening, and empathy, I think are key.
Perfect. Robert, this has been such a great conversation to learn about supply chain as a whole, but also about what's important in an organization. And I always ask this question as my last question before I let you go is, what is that one tip that you would like to give to all the future leaders that are out there, trying to become the next supply chain leader?
Be curious. Don't accept the status quo as being the best, right? There's always going to be a better way of doing something. And if you're curious, if you explore options, if you're open, it's amazing what you can accomplish. So that's probably what I would share with most people. And, don't be afraid to share, right? So many people I've talked to, again, when they come back to me, weeks, months, years later and say, you know what, nobody ever asked me for my opinion. And I'm so happy that you did. And I'll tell them, well, that was one of the best opinions I was ever given because we implemented X, Y, Z. So, open, curious, always believe that there's another way and a better way to do something.
Thank you so much, Rob, for sharing your knowledge and giving us real world examples of things. And it's been truly amazing to share this time with you. And I hope you got something out of this time as well. And thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, Cynthia, thank you. Greatly appreciate the opportunity and hope that this benefits some folks when they get a chance to watch it. So thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much again.